welcome everybody to the Oil Sands Forum. What I want to actually pick up on is some topics that David identified that we have, and I would say as a collective challenge on how we're going to begin and continue to improve a science-based program that we're dealing with and informing and getting proper scientific information and data to inform appropriate decision-making processes that need to be done. And one of the things that comes out and came out of the science reviews that we've had to date, and interestingly, we had a very, very good discussion with our independent science advisory panel, and one of the members, the chair of our panel that now reports through to me and the minister, Dr. Joe Barron, will be giving a talk today at lunch. But that panel also really emphasized and articulated some of the issues that I'm going to be presenting here to this group about what we need to consider in advancing and moving our science forward in the right direction. And that's the notion of scientific integrity and scientific integration, and what those mean and how we can in fact ensure that this is occurring. The oil sands program that we have currently is addressing a multitude of questions. And I think one of the things that we're going to be working continually to improving on is a clear articulation of what questions are being addressed by what aspects of the program, and more importantly, what advances are we making in some of those areas. And in fact, what you're seeing in the program today is our attempt to begin to organize some of the science that we're doing, not only within the government of Alberta and Government of Canada's program on oil sands, but many of you in this audience are part of initiatives and programs that contribute scientifically to the dialogue and the information base by which it informs the direction and the information needs of the gaps of these questions. So examples, again, and you can read all of these, but these are, what are the sources and types of substances that are being released through oil sands development? How are they being distributed in that environment? By what processes and mechanisms? What are the trends? Are things going up? Are they going down? And are they regional in basis or local? How are they being transported and transformed? What are the actual mechanisms by which substances move? And then what happens to them in the environment? Are there secondary products that are occurred? And I think there's science that's showing out there that some of the issues that we might have on contaminants in environments like this are actually secondary byproducts of other processes, not necessarily the initial source material. And then again, the big issue for most people living in those communities and other areas is the so what question. What were the implications of this in terms of ecosystems, in terms of human health? How are organisms potentially being affected by what's occurring? And this is not just from the chemical constituents that might be associated with any type of development like this, but there are other aspects of environmental disturbance that occur. For example, habitat fragmentation and other aspects that are related just to the physical infrastructure being put in, and also population density of people working in the area who have recreational aspects and all kinds of things, a part of being a vibrant community in an area that's dealing with this, that also has a footprint and effect on the biology and ecology of many of the organisms that we're dealing with there, and trying to get an understanding what that is. And then, so that links to the habitat side and regional biodiversity issues, and then how can we better link the observations that we make in these responses to actually attribute cause and hopefully inform better management actions in terms of what needs to be done to either mitigate or improve the situation. The other aspect that we're dealing with in all of this, I very much want to emphasize, is this program is also, and collectively, we're contributing to a very daunting task, and that is trying to understand what the cumulative effects of all these types of stressors and drivers that are occurring in this landscape, how that's culminating in terms of how these systems are responding. So as David mentioned, we want and will continue to strive to be an open, transparent program. And adjudication of this program is very critical. And we did have the science integrity review that did occur on the first 3.5 years of the program, at least under the joint oil sands monitoring program that we were invoked. And as you can see, we got very good press coverage. Good press coverage, in fact, continuing to emphasize we have room for improvement. We need clearer goals. Again, a lot of good science is being done, but not necessarily well represented or articulated in terms of what questions are being addressed. We need to do more work in terms of integration and providing a more holistic program. And again, we got a solid B, which means we didn't entirely fail, but the goal was to be a world-class system for this province, and so we have areas that we certainly need to improve on. So how can we do that? How can we collectively improve as a community here? And there's many representatives here that are from the scientific community, from the environmental community, from industry and others, and governments. How do we actually do this? Well, one of the ways, and it's interesting, these reviews help us shape, and Dr. Hawkins and the international panel that actually presented this to us back in February, is first of all, we need a better delineation of really the policy and scientific goals of programs like this. So if we do good science, how is it actually being used in decision making? And who's looking at it, and what are the decisions? And we have some room, and this is an area we need to improve on in terms of linking the science and policy aspects of what we're dealing with. And in fact, Jill, this is an excellent segue into the talk that our chair of our Independent Science Advisory Committee, Dr. Joe Barron, who's with the United States Geological Survey, she's actually, her lunch hour talk is actually giving some, I believe, insights into perspectives of how maybe we might have ways to interplay some of the challenges that are associated with that interplay. The panel report also said we have to conduct more comprehensive data analysis and interpretation. And when you really look at the report, what they were basically dealing with is it wasn't just a data analysis within a system, but actually, if you take a look at the number of servers and terabytes of information that this program and historical programs are generating, there's huge amounts of information that we are not still very effective of tapping and integrating into sort of a cohesive and directed analysis. That's an area that we need to work on, and I'm going to give some examples perhaps of how we're trying to achieve that. The big thing that they also were saying is that we have stovepiped processes. We've got an air program, we've got a biodiversity program, we've got a water program. And these programs, it's not that the science that's being done within each of these areas is not the right science or whatever, but the questions that we're being asked to address on this landscape requires a braiding or an integration of those particular types of programs to deal with some key questions. And I'm going to demonstrate how we're trying to move forward in that area. And in fact, some of the science that you're going to be seeing presented today by our speakers and also through the poster sessions are beginning to give you a feel for how that is going to be achieved. And as David rightly pointed out, the dialogue and why we're bringing all of you together is actually part of a process to start getting the networking in place to improve this aspect of integration. Another area was dealing with uniformity of quality assurance, quality control. And we're working on it, but there's still areas that still need to be done in terms of we have many organizations involved in the monitoring and science and research that's being done. How do we make that data and information intercomparable in a way that we actually have a common framework that we're basing the discussion on? And that is an important area that still needs improvement. And then, of course, making this data openly and transparently available to the public and to the right end users, so that independent judgment can also be made about what the data is showing. And I think we're going to see in the program, we've specifically set up some areas where there's differences of perspectives. Same data, but differences of perspectives of how to actually analyze it and what what those conclusions might arise by looking at it in a different context. All of those viewpoints are valid. And that's why a meeting like this, and what we hope is continuing to expand and and have this even larger and more comprehensive next year, this is what it's about, is actually allowing that open discourse and discussion about what the data means. So again, we are reminding everybody that in this particular arena of oil sands, we have a very complex landscape. It's not simply just an operator of a specific aspect or sector of that industry doing something on that environment. We have multiple aspects that are occurring in there. We have both point and non-point releases of substances occurring, including things like the municipalities of Fort McMurray itself. You have communities that are discharging into water environments. We have habitat loss occurring from, potentially from the oil sands industry itself, but there's also forestry and other sectors operating in that region. The whole issue about water withdrawals and how that is affecting the systems. And of course, more and more as you read the literature and looking at how Alberta is being looked in both the national and international context about the whole importance and drivers of climate variability and change. And Alberta certainly is in a biophysical area of Canada that is a big issue, and that's another factor that we need to consider in terms of interpreting data and what that means in terms of future directions of some of these systems. Then there's the effect side. Then we're looking at all of these drivers and stressors on the so what. So this is effects on the quality, the chemistry of air, soil, water, the water quantity differences that might be occurring, and teasing that signal apart from local aspects that are occurring versus broader drivers that might be related to things like climate variability. Changes in distribution and abundance of species that are occurring, and many species there are migratory, so coming through that landscape. So some of the aspects that we're dealing with there and the issues that they face as a species are not just place-based, but it could actually be also being driven by other areas that are outside of that landscape that we have to factor in. And then, of course, changes in other ecological processes, and very importantly, the implications for things like human health and human exposures, particularly to the communities that live in that area. Pulling all of this together and making the data meaningful in a way that actually addresses these questions, I think you would all appreciate and would agree that it is complex, and that what we're trying to do is pull together a program to actually deal with this in a much more holistic way. So integration. Everyone says we need to integrate. Or what is that? How do we achieve integration? And I think what I wanted to maybe put out is a little bit of context of integration. I mean, there's some classical definitions of dictionaries that are up here about that. It's an act of bringing together smaller components into a single system, or the end result of processes that bring together often disparate systems so that once you put it all together, it means it becomes a necessary part of the whole. There are all kinds of definitions of what integration should mean. But the way that we achieve it within a program like this is at a variety of levels. And what I've done is I've used two monikers here, the one on the left and one on the right, to indicate there's kind of spectra of integration that occurs. A simple one scientifically is we're going to co-locate sampling locations. It's going to be efficient to have an air station where a water station is. We're going to actually have integration by having standards. The way we measure chemistry in air and water and others is going to be by the same type of analyses and the same standardization. That's integrating across components in terms of analytical approaches. But that doesn't necessarily mean we're achieving the type of integration that's on the other side, on your right side of this slide. And that is that you need to have information on a variety of system processes that actually are focused at addressing a hypothesis or question. And we're trying to refine over the sampling and monitoring programs that we've done, those questions be much more explicitly defined. And we're being much more forceful in saying, this is the type of information needs that we need to integrate across media to answer the question, to answer actually what that means. And I'm going to give you an example what that is in a moment. So again, there are the two examples where we basically are integrating. Here's examples of integration of modeling, sampling, program design, and methods that integrate. We have sampling systems that integrate information. In other words, we're using auto-samplers, automated systems that are integrating information in time. We're also trying to simultaneously measure things using different instrumentations. All of this is a form of integration, but it's still not necessarily achieving the hypothesis side of things that we need to really move forwards to. The reason that we move into having ecological and biological endpoints as part of our monitoring program, and not all environmental monitoring programs do this. They actually often can just sit with the chemistry and the physical aspects of it. We designed this program to have biological and ecological attributes on that landscape as integrators, because organisms live in that landscape, people live in that landscape. So information coming from the biological and ecological side tells us a lot about what's happening, and trying to mesh then what we're seeing on the chemistry and on the physics side is something where we're trying to get a better interplay with. But very importantly is the last one, that we're moving this program, and this is something that the advisory committees wanted to see more and more of, very, very clear articulation now of the questions and hypotheses that this program is to address. We are not monitoring just for the sake of monitoring. And we might be changing and adapting our monitoring in relation to new and emerging issues and questions. And that should be an integral part of the process that we run. And that's why having very clear hypotheses and questions really drives an understanding of what not only the gaps in information it needs, but where we need to put it together. So what are we doing in some of these areas right now? On the air quality side, we're doing all kinds of activities. And you see, what I've tried to do is actually use just those two symbols of different types of integration on how each of these areas are beginning to use both of those types of integration in terms of moving and advancing the program forward. So we're doing core monitoring on regional air quality, with particulate matters and other chemical constituents that really are linking to ambient air standards, and trying to also inform the public about what those are. We're working very hard on trying to identify all sources of emissions and what they are in terms of chemical constituents and what they're coming from. We're working very hard that if things are being emitted in that environment through the atmosphere, where's it ending up? What's being deposited? Where is it being deposited? And again, you can see that question, and on the deposition side, we're designing the program on not just what's deposited, but what's the implication and so what question on the receiving environment itself, on the organisms and the receiving endpoints about what that might mean. And then, of course, working on integrating the results themselves. We're working literally in this program more and more from cells to satellites, and trying to ground truth and use new monitoring and technologies to advance our understanding of what's going on. And there are papers that are being presented in this session today that will be giving examples of how we moved on that front. Similarly, on the water quality and quantity side, we're measuring chemical substances, in lakes, rivers, wetland and surface waters and groundwaters, suspended sediments, depositional sediments that are being moved in this area. We're measuring a lot, both in here and the other on the air side, trying to define what we would consider baseline conditions. We're using new approaches or testing them. Semi-permeable membrane devices, or really just think of them as membranes that are trying to act as an organism, where we could put it out in the environment and it's accumulating things like PAHs, and we're trying to understand what that accumulation rate is and how that might link to exposure of real organisms in that environment. We're measuring water flows and water levels because the original design was to have a mass balance understanding of what's being contributed to these river systems off the landscape and off of point and non-point sources, and getting an understanding of where it's ending up. To do that, you need proper flow and hydrological information along with the chemistry, and we've designed the system and we're improving design on how to make that interplay. A large program on the same thing now is on the so what side, so it's on the receiving side on the aquatic environment. So we're working with benthic invertebrates, the bugs that live in the river. They are integrating exposure to all kinds of things, flows, chemistry, and we're trying to understand how changes in the patterns and abundance of these organisms are reflective of environmental conditions. We have a significant program building on experience of things like the Federal Environmental Effects Monitoring Program that has been used in these systems for pulp and paper, and nationally, both in the region and nationally, and metal mining, on fish health indicators and using endpoints of organisms that are a fish in this area, both in terms of sentinel species that are good and reflective of this, but also ones that, and moving more towards, that are important to Indigenous and other groups in the area about what the state and health of these fish are, and how can we link that to actual attribution of cause. And we've been doing a range of toxicology, both in the field and in the lab. And that has involved not just federal work, but there's a network of scientists, including university-based research, that has been very much involved in contributing our knowledge on the toxicological effect of these of waterborne contaminants. And again, working on integration. And in fact, we're going to have one example tomorrow of one of the first of the major types of synthesis reports of the 3 years of data that we're dealing with in terms of integrating the water data. And we have a lot more of these beginning to come out across both in this coming year and subsequently, of pulling these data systems together about interpreting what this means. Not just what the monitoring program is showing, but what we have also from historical information. Same thing on terrestrial biodiversity and ecosystem health, where we're beginning to get more information on the human disturbance and linear footprints that are occurring within this landscape. Quantifying habitat disruption, working on trying to get an understanding of changes in regional biodiversity, but also at a local scale. Then there's the whole aspect on many of these of the mammals and birds and other organisms that live in these environments. What are the contaminant levels in them? Are we seeing observable effects, and what are the implications of that? And very much, this is an area that we're beginning to work much more, and there's certainly significant room for improvement on how we're going to do this, is working with our Indigenous communities and others on getting a program design that also resonates on endpoints that are meaningful to those communities. And the berry contaminant study that's being done up in the wood buffalo area is a very good example of how we've moved in that direction. So again, what we've got is, we know there's other types of integration, but this is where we really want to be in our program. And this is why this type of forum is important. That when we look at endpoints on these systems, which is really the so what question, we have all kinds of different pieces that have to be part of that picture and actually designed explicitly into actually addressing the question. In addressing that, there's also related to the mathematics and statistics behind this in terms of repeatability, confidence, all of the elements that also provide credibility to the program, and that's behind all of this. So from a pictorial point of view, this is how we've got the issue of PAHs, polyaromatic hydrocarbons, the sources of them, of which there are multiple, from the industry itself on the one side, from natural forest fires, tailings ponds, from maybe mining operations, or all kinds of ways that PAHs can enter this particular environment. What we've got are a number of studies going on and looking where they're ending up in the fate. And now those are those middle pictures, where we've got instrumentation, we're taking snow samples, water samples, sediment samples, doing the chemistry to trying to understand where those sources are ending up. And then on the source side, huge amounts of analytical chemistry and work being done, and modeling even being done on the interplay between the source and the fate. And then on the other end here, the kinds of things that we're dealing on in relation to the effect side, of where they are ending up and what the implications are, to the biota and organisms that are in the area. Integration also occurs and must occur in another aspect of this program. So that's sort of in science design, but every one of those areas are generating data. And there's historical data that has been collected using certain methodologies, and what we're trying to do is also look at how compatible are our contemporary measures and the directions that we're heading. How can we capitalize on the existing information and move it forward in terms of using the whole data system? So data management and the evaluation and reporting is a very critical piece of our program here that we collectively contribute to. We actually want all of you that are generating data to be part of a broader consortium. This is not just the oil sands program. Every one of you that are involved in data generation should be part in seeing that should be contributory to the dialogue and in the information base. And what David and I are challenged with in these programs is coming up with, we have a data portal now. We know that there's much more work that can be done in that vein, but we have, this is a huge area that we need to work on in terms of making sure that data not only goes into data systems, but is openly accessible to the program and others to use and interpret. The other thing that we needed to embark on in a forum like this is, again, just but one avenue, is much more robust and open and transparent reporting of results. And we are using the standard of peer-reviewed scientific literature as one of the areas that we certainly want to ensure that we continue to do, but also public discourse like this is also a very important part of the reporting. So again, this is just a quick snapshot in terms of the oil sands program, where we were back when we started in 2010, 2011. And my only point being is, if I'm going to flip to the next slide, if you take a look, this is basically where we're sitting with monitoring efforts now. And in 2016, we're beginning to pepper this landscape with a lot of monitoring effort. But there's still areas that we need to embark on. There are areas of the geography that we know we need better baseline conditions defined. We know we need to refine where we're actually doing some of our work and moving our efforts, but it has to be linked to what I was saying before, the hypotheses and the questions that need to be addressed within the program. And so we've made significant gains, but we certainly have a ways to go and to continue to improve and adapt the program. One of the other things I want to also emphasize, and David mentioned this, is an area that we collectively needed to work on, and there is a commitment, certainly on behalf of how we're designing monitoring programs, not only in oil sands, but even from a provincial point of view, is really getting meaningful and proper involvement of Indigenous communities and the proper application of traditional ecological knowledge in the program. We have some current activities that we're just beginning to move in that direction. And there's a strong commitment for us to collectively work in having these knowledge systems working together in building an overall and better initiative. And in fact, we've dedicated an aspect of this program tomorrow on a panel discussion, and we're fortunate to have Dr. Leary Littlebear giving us information and a keynote address on big thinking and rethinking in terms of how we actually bring some of these knowledge systems together. And so I think it'll be an exciting discussion that we're going to have in terms of how we move forward in that regard. So to end, this program is adaptive. In our Science Advisory Committee meetings yesterday, we also used the term flexibility and also, very importantly, continuity. We're trying to make sure that we've got continuity where we need it, but we adapt the program accordingly in terms of as the questions get answered, there are new issues that we need to address, and we need to focus on those areas. So as we move forward, we certainly are looking at increased engagement in the broadest sense of the environmental scientific community, all of us playing a part, It's not the people just within the program, but us as a collective. Broadening our science base by increasing the use and incorporation of things like Indigenous science and community-based monitoring and traditional knowledge into the design and implementation of the program. Expanding our knowledge and standardization of baseline, and you're going to see some interesting discussion. We have some work to do there, and what we mean by that. What will be the baseline conditions that we are comparing our data to say that we have changes in status and trends? That dialogue in itself is an important one to have, and we haven't settled on that, and we're going to have some interesting perspectives, I think, presented at this forum in terms of what that might be. We're going to be focusing and committing our efforts to having much more evaluation being done and reporting, and this also includes network reassessments. We've designed programs, but they're not static. We are re-examining whether or not we're collecting the right data in the right places at the right time to address the questions. And that will be an ongoing process to continually improve what we're dealing with here. Enhancing the open availability of data from all sources, and then, of course, very critically, to actually inform any type of mitigative or regulatory policy decision-making processes, we need a better interplay between the science and the findings in relation to the prediction and understanding of that stressor-response relationship. What's occurring in that environment? What's the response? What can we basically deal with mitigating those responses? And again, in a very challenging context that we have to do this in a cumulative effects type of perspectives. And again, there's an area we talk about cumulative effects, but the science and how we deal with that there's still a lot of discussion about how to approach the data and how do we actually inform those processes. So with that, what David and I were giving you is hopefully giving some, setting the scene in terms of why this forum is so critical in a program like this, but I think critical to all of us as interested members of various aspects of both the scientific and other communities in advancing a program like this as we continue to evolve and proceed with this.